The blood on Ana Duarte's knuckles was fresh and smelled of oil and iron and something else, something metallic that tasted like regret. And when Luke "Rook" Mercer stepped into the kitchen of the ramshackle farmhouse he'd inherited, he thought, for a terrible second, that the country had finally come for him. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. He would have expected mice. He would have expected the thick, dry silence of rooms that had forgotten laughter. He would have expected the wind to move through the porch boards like a lawyer checking his lines. He did not expect Mama to be in his kitchen, grease on her forearms, a streak of soot on the curve of one cheek, a small boy asleep with his head against the old oak table, and he did not expect his own chest to tighten as if someone had put a band around his ribs. Anna looked up when he closed the door. Her eyes were blunt, like two flintstones struck against one another. Up close, he could see the thin scar cutting near her eyebrow, the way her jaw clenched as if she were always about to bite down on something hard and not let it go. The boy on the chair stirred, opened one sleepy eye, and then, when he saw the patch of red and black on Rook's vest, the Hells Angels colors he had carried like a second skin for 20 years, he sat bolt upright and put a hand over his mother like a shield. "You can't be here," Rook said, and his voice had the flat, controlled quality he used in meetings, the voice that made men obey or leave. It's how he closed deals and opened fights. It was the voice that kept the charter intact. Anna wiped her hands on a rag that smelled of diesel and lemon and shook her head. "We can be wherever we need to be," she said. Her words were small and measured, but there was an iron rod behind them. "We're not looking for trouble." Rook's first instinct, every president's first instinct when someone crossed his boundary, was to throw them out. The farmhouse sat on land people in town had taken to calling Mercer Hollow, a stretch of two-lane highway and broken fence posts that had been in his family longer than the club had existed. It was his alone, legally. His father had kept it as a kind of coin, a place to disappear when the road wore thin. For years it had been empty, a monument to things that got left behind. But then Anna showed him the boy's name stitched inside a small torn sweatshirt, Mateo. Her voice softened when she said it. "He's 12. The word hung in the air like an accusation and a plea. Rook had never been a man to cradle anything soft. He'd been forged by winters on the back of a Harley, by men who lived by split-second decisions and the belief that mercy was an exploitable weakness. Making compassion into strategy was dangerous in his world. Mercy could be capitalized against him. But mercy could also be the kindling for something else, something he'd shut away long ago. He stepped out onto the porch, which sagged like a man who'd swallowed too much. Mateo watched him with the kind of intense, wary curiosity children learned from watching adults bargaining for safety. In the dirt beyond the porch, Rook's bike glinted like a loaded promise. He should have left. He should have ridden back to the clubhouse, filed a report, demanded a vote. Instead, he lit a cigarette with hands that trembled just enough for him to notice. He exhaled and said to the empty yard and to the family in his kitchen, "You got until nightfall." Anna's relief wasn't theatrical, it was the practical kind. A small hitch in her shoulders and the way she folded her hands around a coffee mug as if it were a warm stone. "Thank you," she said. No one had said it to her in that tone before. Not since she'd buried the man who'd promised her the world and left her with a boy and a quiet wreck that had rerouted her life. Word traveled fast in the county and faster among bikers. By dusk, one of Rook's prospects, a lanky kid named Hector who'd been on probation since he'd peeled paint off a rival's bike in a bar fight, came by to check the perimeter. He found Rook on the porch with two steaming cups between them and a small chipped radio humming country music that neither of them really listened to. "That woman and kid, what's the play, Prez?" Hector asked, eyes flicking to the open kitchen window where Anna was moving, efficient and quiet. Rook did not flinch, because he had learned early how to make decisions in full public view. He said plainly, "They stay. For now." Hector's mouth parted. "We can't have," he started, then shut it. In the club, "we can't have" was a sentence usually finished with violence or exile. Rook knew the litany of what his men would consider betrayal. He also knew how the men would look at him when their expectations shifted. The first night they stayed, the house reassembled itself. Dishes stacked in the sink, a blanket spread on a second-hand couch, the boys' small collection of model cars lined up like soldiers on the mantel. Mateo slept on the floor of what had been Rook's father's bedroom, curled in on himself like a coin being saved. Anna took the room that had once been used for storage because she wanted the best light for fixing small engines beside the back door. Rook watched them move through the house like ghosts learning how to be people again. He watched Anna draw a bath with a stern concentration he recognized. It was the same look he'd seen once in the rear view of a mercy he'd granted to a brother who'd needed it. Whatever softness he allowed now was calculated, like a map. He drew the line at the front gate, but he left a path through the yard. There were murmurs. The club's elders called him into a secluded room above the clubhouse and asked why he'd left a stranger in a Mercer house. "We don't hand out crumbs," said Big Walsh, who had the voice of gravel and the long memory of a man who'd been in the MC before Rook's hair had gone silver. "You sling charity and you make enemies of a lot of men who think charity is a sign of rot. You understand the optics." Rook listened. He listened like a man who had to decide whether to keep a tooth or pull it. There were risks. Clay Winters, who ruled the nomads with a crown of threats, could take mercy for weakness and smear it into the soil. His own prospects could turn whispers into ballots. The club was a living thing that fed on clarity and punished softness. But back at the farmhouse, when Mateo found Rook's old toolbox in the shed and opened it like a feast, Rook felt something unfamiliar move inside him. The faint, dangerous ache of wanting to be someone who made a child laugh without cost. Mateo asked how the engine in a 1978 Triumph worked, the way a boy asks the first of 1,000 questions that want to be answered with patience and not excuses. Rook told him in small doses, watching the boy's jaw do that same clenched business as if he were savoring a new tool. Anna didn't flirt. She didn't soften her edges for him. The only thing close to intimacy was when she caught his eyes while passing a wrench and held his gaze as if measuring whether he was the kind of man who would hand a thing back unaltered. Once, late, she stood in the doorway with a plate of scrambled eggs and slid them across to him without comment. The gesture was precise and sacred. He ate because to decline would have been to offend a person who'd offered something hard. His men saw it as indulgence. Clay smelled it as weakness. The town, which worshipped legend and feared the patch, raised cautious eyebrows. Still, Rook let them stay. His mercy was the kind people in his world reserved for blood, complicated, indebted, binding. There was a story etched into Anna's posture that she refused to tell him in full. Sometimes, when she thought the boy was asleep, she drove, a beat-up truck that chattered like an old throat, down to the river where she sat with the water's noise and whispered a name into the current for reasons that made her lips thin. Rook learned the shape of that grief in the small things, the way her fingers hesitated on Mateo's head, the way she folded his shirts with a care that bordered on prayer. She kept the details locked away like an engine's secret compartment. He could feel the weight of it, heavy as a transmission, but she wouldn't open it. The country noticed when he let them stay. One of Clay Winter's men, a snake with a gap-toothed grin named Lyle, came by and left a beer with a note. "Keep your animals penned or the fences get burned down." Rook placed that beer on the porch table and watched the empty bottle catch the moon. He could have started a war then, posted men at the farmhouse, called the charter to a violent, satisfying meeting. He didn't. He thumbed the ash from his cigarette and thought of Mateo asleep on the floor, and of all the boys he'd seen go hard and disappear. Inside the club, whispers grew teeth. Prospects made pointed remarks. An old friend who'd bled with him in more than one scrape asked why he'd allowed strangers on their land. Rook answered as he always had, with a sentence that was meant to end the argument. "They're staying," he said, and his voice was the law. The law held, but it hummed with tension underneath it, like a wire that might snap. That first week, an older man from town, Mrs. Klein's son, came by, muttering about how the angels were supposed to be bearers of fear, not charity. He spat on the dirt near the porch and called Anna a freeloader. Mateo ran outside, fists balled, and Rook watched him go the way the boy's father had before him, a sputtering stand-in for a man who'd been taken by the road or by his own choices. Rook's instinct told him to step between them. He didn't. He let the boy try first, because Anna had taught him more than one stubbornness, and he wanted her to keep that. Mateo got tossed like a rag in a scuffle that ended quickly with him bruised and furious, and Anna a storm. Rook stepped into the fight then, not because he was the president, but because fire had lit in him that could not be quenched by rules. He took the older man's arm and broke the angle of his elbow with a hand that had been practiced in violence for decades. The man lay on the ground, and the porch was suddenly full of silence. Anna's eyes were a matrix of gratitude and fury and something unreadable. She thanked him without words. Her hand brushed his right after, the brief collision of palms that said, in the way things do when words are too expensive, neither of us is helpless. Still, mercy in their world had a price, and Rook could feel it building like a storm in the distant hills. The ledger would need balancing, favors owed, threats answered, votes won, and he knew, with a clarity that made his teeth ache, that what he had started by letting them stay would ripple outward until it hit every bone in the charter. He also knew that there was a small, stubborn part of him that wanted the farmhouse to remain full, wanted the boy to tinker with engines under his watch, and wanted Anna to keep bringing him plates of eggs. It was a dangerous, ridiculous longing. It was also, for the first time in a long time, real. The first thunderbolt came not from Clay Winters, but from within the clubhouse. Soft, precise, like a knuckle rapping a skull, when Big Walsh called a private meeting to remind every man of how old rules were kept. Rook sat at the head, the patch heavy on his chest, the faces around him lit by the low hum of a single hanging bulb. They wanted to know why he'd let two outsiders squat in Mercer Hollow when the club had spent decades carving its borders with iron. They wanted to know whether his mercy was a prelude to peril. He answered again with that baritone that had sent men straight to the tarpaulin. They stay. He did not spell out the calculus that had led him there, the way Anna's hands had fit around a wrench, the way Mateo had lifted the Triumph valve cover with reverence. He did not tell them about the ache he'd felt when the boy fell asleep with his cheek on Rook's old tool roll. You didn't explain tenderness in a room full of men who measured everything by consequence. You declared it, and then you braced for the storm. The storm came in gestures and timid votes. Spencer, a man with a scar that split his lip and a hunger for ascension, floated the idea that keeping Anna and Mateo gave anyone the right to question Rook's authority. He kept his voice even, the way venom hides behind a smile. "Ain't our house, Prez. Ain't our town. We got rules." Rook watched Spencer with the flat patience of a man who'd learned to let wolves show their teeth before he decided how to skin them. He said nothing in that moment. Authority, he'd discovered, sometimes spoke loudest when silent. Yet the silence did not stop the whisper campaign. Someone left a bag of flour on the porch of the farmhouse with a note, "They drain from the cup of our men." Back at Mercer Hollow, the days bled into a rhythm that felt almost domestic in its dangerous novelty. Anna taught Mateo how to lay out a gasket with careful fingers. Rook did not intrude on those lessons. Instead, he sat near enough to hear the boys' questions and to correct a stubborn torque measurement. He found himself learning the contours of their lives like a man keeping a map of a new route. The small detours and the places you had to slow to see the markers. He learned that Anna hummed when she worked, and that she hummed old songs whose meaning she'd kept folded in her ribs. He learned what Mateo's laugh sounded like when he found a stripped bolt that fit, the raw happiness of a child who'd been taught how to hold tools and not just survival. Outside, the county simmered. Clay Winters asked soft questions at the edges of conversations, the political predator using curiosity to scent weakness. When Rook rode into town, men's eyes tracked him differently now, half speculation, half hope. Their code did not include people like Anna, but townsfolk were complicated, and so were codes. Women in the diner watched the farmhouse's porch lights come on earlier than they used to and whispered that maybe the angel was softening. Men who had been afraid of the patch for years dared to entertain the idea that mercy could be a new kind of power. In the evenings, after the dishes were washed and Mateo was asleep, Anna and Rook sat on the porch with the quiet that arrives after the world has been fought down a notch. They did not speak of the club. They did not speak of the things that made Rook a legend. They spoke instead of the tangible, the way oil darkened the seam of an engine block, the stubbornness of a stubborn screw, the wrong way to bend a spring so it would never give back. There was an intimacy in those lessons, practical, unadorned, that felt more revelatory to Rook than any confession. One late night, a storm broke over Mercer Hollow in a thin, angry braid of rain. The power went out and the radio was dead. The farmhouse smelled like wet wood and the iron tang of a mechanical heart. Anna boiled water by candlelight and made coffee with hands that trembled once, only when she faced him. She set a cup down in front of him and watched as he sipped. The light in her eyes was raw. "You ever wanted a different life?" she asked, not turning her head. Rook's throat tightened. He could have lied. Men in his position lied often and well. Instead, he said, with the kind of truth that made him rarer than any patch, "Sometimes. When I was younger, I thought the road would take me somewhere else. It took me more roads, but they were the same road." He set his mug down, and when the candlelight caught the lines at the sides of his eyes, Anna's mouth softened like a hinge. She listened, and then she said, quietly, "I left the city because it chewed up the man I loved and spat him out. I learned how to turn a wrench so I could keep breathing." Her words were thin as wire and strong as cable. There was a plea beneath them, not for pity, but for recognition. Rook did not grant recognition lazily. He gave it with the slow care of a man who valued honesty over sentiment. He told her about the time he'd ridden 2 days straight and broken his own heart over a decision that left a brother on the side of the road. He told her, without romanticizing, about the way decisions in his life had had teeth. Anna heard it, and in the exchange, something like forgiveness passed between them. The practical forgiveness of two people who'd both survived by not letting the soft in. Their closeness made the charter restless. Marcus, a prospect who'd been like a younger brother to Rook once, bristled openly one afternoon when he found the two of them working side by side in the shed. Anna holding a carburetor, Rook passing her the right-sized jets with a steady hand. "We look weak," Marcus said, voice sharp. "We show the world we're soft." Rook didn't hit him. He let the comment hang like a loose socket until Marcus corrected himself. "Don't hit me, Prez," he said, ashamed. But the damage had been made. The idea that their leader tolerated softness spread like oil in a gutter. Then Clay escalated. A truck with no plates rolled slowly past the farmhouse at dusk, and a man with a camera took pictures from the bed. The snapshot reached Clay's table, and he laughed a small, cruel laugh. Clay's crew were experts at widening fissures. They fed the rumor mill that Rook had been compromised by pity, that his leadership had softened to accommodate outsiders. The rumors found purchase among those in the club who hungered for clean lines and predictable enemies. Rook fought back, not with words at first, but with presence. He rode more often to the farmhouse, making sure his men saw him with Anna and Mateo in ways that were controlled yet candid. He held court on the porch, and when his men came, he served coffee and passed plates and let them see that the house was still Mercer's. Different, yes, but not surrendered. It was a spectacle and a defiance and a kind of argument made in domesticity. Anna refused to be a pawn. When Clay's men left notes and emptied sacks of animal feed onto the lawn, when someone slashed the sidewall of a spare tire, she kept her head down and fixed what needed fixing. She did not hide the way every vandalism knotted her stomach. She did not bow to fear. She mended what was broken and taught Mateo to do the same. The boy learned to carry himself as though he belonged to someone who would not be moved. Seeing her work pulled something in Rook that didn't look like mercy and didn't look like guard, something like awe. Their fragile peace held for a while, but tensions that live near the surface are always hungry for an opening. That opening came when the county sheriff told Rook that someone had filed a complaint about unlawful habitation. The sheriff wasn't aggressive. He was a man who knew which way the wind blew and who had a habit of keeping his hands clean by pointing to the legalities. Rook met him at the gate and watched as the county paper in the sheriff's hand bore down like a tribunal. "We can exempt you," the sheriff said, "if the charter backs the legal process." It was a polite way of saying the club could legitimize them or put pressure. Rook considered his options. He could have sloughed the problem into bureaucracy and let the sheriff take the fall. He could have argued the town into a corner. He could have told Anna they had to vanish before the law pursued them. He did none of those things. Instead, he went to the meeting where the charter would vote on how to handle the complaint. He walked into the clubhouse and saw faces he'd built an empire with, men who'd ridden beside him through winters and blood. He spoke plainly. "We protect what's ours, and what's ours now includes a woman and a boy who need a place to stand. If you vote against them, you vote against how I see the world. I don't need your permission to protect them, but I will take your counsel. We are the law in this valley. Let's make it a better one." The room pulsed with power, the old dynamics vibrating like a guitar string. Some men shifted, others hardened, and a small, dangerous faction led by Spencer cast their votes like knives. The vote passed by a thin margin, the motion to allow Rook to keep Anna and Mateo under the charter's protection. The result should have been a bomb, but it was something else, a compulsion to watch for cracks. After the meeting, Spencer cornered Rook in the parking lot, jaw working. "You'd make us look soft to the world," he said, low. "You'd make us look like we take pity." Rook's answer was patient and lethal in its simplicity. "We look like people." Spencer spat and walked away. The factions simmered. Clay smiled across his glass at a table in his bar, thinking of ways to exploit the fissure. And Rook rode home with the taste of blood in his mouth that was not his own. Back at the farmhouse, when Mateo found a small rusted emblem in a growth of grass behind the shed, a fragment of an old patch, perhaps left by Rook's father, he took it to Anna as though it were treasure. She traced the edges with a finger, and then, in a motion that surprised them both, she folded the tiny scrap into the boy's hand and pressed it against his heart. "You keep it," she said, "so you know what it feels like to have something that belongs to you." Rook watched from the porch, and the sight of it, a woman teaching a boy to hold something steady in the palm of his chest, felt like a verdict. He felt in that small domestic act the impossible recalibration of his life's compass. The club would gripe, Clay would threaten, Spencer would plot. But in the quiet of his porch, with the rain slow and soft and the patch of moon sitting like a promise, Rook allowed himself a thought he had never permitted. Maybe protection could be tenderness. Maybe, he thought, a leader could risk love without losing power. But tenderness, like mercy, carries its own liability. There were men, old enough and stubborn enough, who believed that showing softness to outsiders unmoored the charter's backbone. There were rivals who saw mercy as a weakness to be exploited, and there were the law's paper knives waiting to be used. The ledger of consequence does not forgive easily. Rook knew that what he had created by opening his door was a new battlefield, one where the stakes were their daily life and not just territory. As night fell and the farmhouse settled, someone climbed the fence and left a small, neat card under the door. Clay's signature, clean, arrogant, sat in the corner. The message was short: "Enjoy your new family while you can." Rook picked up the card and crushed it in his fist until the paper cracked. He did not show the men at the clubhouse that he'd been rattled. He put the crumpled evidence in his pocket and rode out after midnight into the road that cut through the valley, the kind of ride he'd once taken to clear his head. The lights of other houses winked away as he rode, and the world narrowed to the feel of wind and the steady beat of his machine. He thought of Anna humming, of Mateo's small tentative laugh, of the way the boy's hand had hovered over an engine like a priest at an altar. When he returned, dawn was touching the sky with cold fingers. Anna and Mateo were on the porch, two silhouettes in the neutral light, and when they saw him, Mateo ran to him as if blood had told him to. Rook knelt and felt the boy's small arms wrap around his neck. For a moment, one perfect, treacherous moment, Rook let himself imagine a life that included this: engines tinkered with in the golden light, plates of eggs handed across a wood table, the sound of a small voice asking a million tiny questions. It was a dangerous imagining. It was also the first thing in a long time that felt like a home. He stood then and looked out at the hills, the cut gravel road leading back to the clubhouse like a spine. He felt, more clearly than ever, that the road he'd ride from here on would be different. He would have to fight for what he'd let in. He would have to face Clay, placate his men, and reckon with the law. But for now, the porch held them together, and the morning held its breath. And somewhere out there, Clay Winters was smiling, because he believed he'd found the chink. The region would hold its judgment like a candle in the wind, waiting for the next gust to decide whether to burn the house down or to light it brighter. Rook tightened his jaw and felt the weight of his choice settle like a stone in his chest. Choices have consequences. Mercy, he now knew, did too. He turned to Anna then and said, quietly, but with the kind of finality that the road had taught him, "I don't ask you to trust the patch. I ask you to trust me." Anna looked at him, and for the first time she did not hide anything behind engineered stoicism. There was fear there, sharp, animal, but there was also a flicker of something else, the beginning of belief. She extended her hand, the grease still faint under her nails, and for a moment, with the dawn warming the boards at their feet, the two of them made a small, fragile truce. It was not love yet, not the thing the world feared. It was an agreement to fight together. It was the first step toward a precarious, dangerous, and beautiful life that would force a charter to reckon with what it meant to be a family. Outside, the valley kept its secrets, and the road hummed its endless promise. Inside the farmhouse, the smell of coffee rose like a benediction. The first fracture came not as a roar, but as a small, precise click, the sound of a hinge in a house that had been holding too much weight. Anna found the photograph in the shed, tucked beneath a coil of wire where dust had kept it secret. It was an old Polaroid, edges browned and soft, and in the yellowed center, a young man grinned with his arm slung over a bike's gas tank. Written in a careless hand on the back were words that made the letters feel like accusations. "For when I'm gone, T." Mateo found his mother standing over the picture, with her hand pressed hard to her mouth, as if to stop the word from leaving. When she saw Rook in the doorway, his shadow long from the shed's weak bulb, she looked at him like a woman who'd been asked to forgive a man twice dead. "He's my husband," she said, without making it a plea. The steam of 1,000 small reckonings seemed to rise from both of them and hang between them. Rook heard the name before she could speak it. Tomas Duarte, the wreck, the night the city spat a man out onto a wet curb and swallowed him whole. The wound that had made Anna come westward, the one the town had pity for and never asked about. Tomas. Rook's hand clenched without his warder. Anna told the story in pieces, sharp, efficient fragments, like a mechanic outlining the parts of a broken engine and where they'd failed. Tomas had been drunk the night his car left the road. He'd hit a pole, his head took the worst of it, and he'd been gone. The city blamed the darkness. The coroner blamed a blood alcohol level. Anna had buried the man and the life she'd built with him, then come until her truck coughed and the light here felt cleaner. She never said the part about who'd called the tow, the part about whose head had looked up and thought, in the second before a decision took shape, that the world could run without him. Rook listened and felt a grinding in his teeth. He knew the wreck. He had been there on the edge of it years ago, a silhouette in the rain, watching the smoke and hearing the police tape snap like a warning. He had not touched Tomas then, but he had made other choices in other nights, decisions that let men fall when they needed hands. He had ridden on because that's what the road taught. Keep moving. He had never told Anna because he had never been asked in the right way, the ways people ask things when they need to know the truth, not because it would inflame them, but because it would free them. Then Spencer leaned forward with the kind of smile that leaves scabs. He had been around the clubhouse long enough to know how to make a rumor look like a fact. He had a folder now, pages folded into each other, old police reports, a road name matched to the county file, a witness note he'd procured from a city drunk who remembered a man on a bike and a car that went too fast. He brought it to the clubhouse with the theatricality of a man who'd found a blade. He set the papers on the table and watched men look, the room shrinking around the sense that the table's edges might be the only place left to land. "You knew," Anna said the night the files came to light. "You knew, and you came here to watch me live like I didn't know." Her voice cut, then receded into a small, fierce echo. She had found a photograph of Rook in a paper from the day after Tomas's crash, a bike caught in the margin like a ghost, and a name, Mercer, scribbled by a hand that didn't know how to keep secrets. Anna's world, which she had folded tight and carried like a muffler against the cold, unfurled into a map of betrayals. Rook tried to explain. He stood on the farmhouse porch where the night smelled like wet dirt and old promises. He told the truth that fit like a plain tool. He had seen the crash, he'd been there, and he'd watched rescue teams work in the rain. He had not caused the wreck. He had, in other years and other places, ridden away from other decisions. His life was threaded with the ghosts of choices that felt righteous then and hollow now. He told her, and the telling only made the air between them heavier. Anna's fists went white as she gripped the rail. "You let us in," she said, voice small and brave. "You kept us, and you lied to me in the way that matters." She folded back the photograph, and it looked to Rook like a small paper verdict. I didn't come here to be a secret. The clubhouse fractured like a windshield struck by a fist. Men he'd grown up with found their mouths full of new accusations. Spencer pressed with the intimacy of a man used to winning through corrosion. "You kept this from us," he said. "If the charter's name is smeared with a lie, we get the mess." He pushed the papers across the table like thin threats and watched the men around him choose sides. Some stood with Rook because they trusted his judgment. Some hesitated because loyalty meant following lines that had been laid long before new feelings complicated the map. The vote that had come down in Rook's favor now turned on a knife. Certain men wanted Anna and Matteo gone, not because they hated the boy or the woman, but because the idea that their leader could be moved by anything but the club struck at them like a disease. They could not call it out as fear. They called it purity. The rhetoric was clean, but the intent was sharp. In the farmhouse, Anna packed. She did not make a show of it. No raised voices, no slammed doors. She filled a duffel with shirts, with Matteo's few toys, with the little practical things that make a life livable. Matteo watched her with an expression of quiet alarm. Children have a way of taking the measure of safety and finding its edges. "We'll go back into town," Anna said. "We'll find a place where we don't have to be someone's bet." When Rook found her in the kitchen with the lamp low and the radio dead, she had a single photograph tucked under her palm and a look in her eyes that said she had counted the cost and found the scale tipped. "You told me to trust you," she said. Her voice was calm until it wasn't. "I trusted you because of what you let me keep. Truth matters to me. If you couldn't be clear, if you kept me in a ledger of mercy and lies, then I won't stay where the ledger decides my worth." He reached for her hand. She did not pull away, but she did not respond in the way he wanted. Rook was a man used to moving pieces on a board. This was not a piece to be moved. This was a person who had been broken and was, with every meal and every repair, knitting herself back together. He had broken one of her stitches by keeping a truth that mattered hidden. "What are you trying to protect?" Anna asked, not unkindly, but with a ferocity that unbuttoned parts of him he'd sewn closed. "The charter? Your men? Or yourself?" Rook could have told her it was all of them. He could have told her that he'd feared that if he'd been completely honest, someone would use a dead man's name to set fire to the cottage and to him. He could have told her that he had wanted to keep the farmhouse safe and that he thought protecting her from his history would be a mercy. He said instead, in the kind of answer that always cost him more, "I protected the way I knew how. I thought it would make it easier." She laughed, a short, sharp sound. "Easier for who?" Matteo knelt on the floor, head bowed over a small engine piece he'd been cleaning. He looked up at them, and the child's face asked the question adults refuse to ask, "Are we safe?" Rook could not guarantee it. The clubhouse had teeth, and Spencer sharpened them in private. Clay's smirks had teeth. The law's thin paper had teeth. The ledger of consequence snapped like a trap. Spencer's faction pushed harder. They planted stories in the diner, whispered to town workers who had grudges, and sweetened the poisonous drink by tying Rook's name to every rumor. A man with a camera took shots of Anna carrying a box out to the pickup and posted them under a handle that smelled like scandal. Clay sent a card with a mocking signature. The farmhouse's thin peace buckled. What broke the fragile truce was not one violent act, but a betrayal so small in its cruelty that it felt like a crack of ice. Lyle, Clay's gap-toothed man who liked to leave things where they hurt, sat with Spencer one night and handed over a copy of Rook's ledger. It wasn't a ledger of money, but of favors, of who had been helped and why. Lyle had been inside the clubhouse and had watched Rook sign a paper that recognized Anna and Matteo as protected. That paper, once in Spencer's hand, became a weapon. Spencer printed it and left copies in the mailboxes of men he thought he could sway. The message was plain: who sheltered strangers risked the charter. Some men took the paper and folded it like a map. Others took it and threw it away. But the seed had been planted and watered. Anna packed the last of their things and waited as if for a signal. Rook stood at the doorway, the patch on his chest catching the light like a moon. He should have brought men, should have marshaled force, should have beaten the truth into obedience. Instead, he stood, a man who'd worn mercy like a weapon, now seeing how easily it could be used against those he tried to protect. He could see the fracture lines in faces he'd trusted, and the sight made something inside him hunch like a dog. "You can leave," he told her, and his voice did not beg. "I can't make you stay where you aren't wanted." Anna's hands tightened around the duffel. "You can tell me the whole truth," she said, "or you can let me go. Don't give me both half-truths and a porch to stand on." Rook swallowed. He wanted to tell her everything: how he'd ridden that night Tomas died, how he'd decided which wounds to stitch and which to leave to scar, how the road had taught him to measure mercy in miles. He wanted to untangle the ledger of his life and give her whatever thread she asked for. He didn't, because words could be used like knives, and because he feared that the full truth, if it came out, would set Clay's men licking their lips. So he did the only thing he could. He promised a future in the only way men of his world promised anything meaningful. "I'll stand with you," he said. "I'll answer for what I did and what I didn't. I'll fight them all if I have to." She left anyway that night, with Mateo at her elbow and a duffel at her back, the taillights of her truck disappearing down the gravel like a sigh. Rook watched until the porch light went dark and the house became a silhouette of things he could not yet save. The clubhouse would call for men to choose sides. The town would speak in whispers. Clay would sharpen his smile into a plan. Inside him, something reconciled, and something else split open so wide it bled memory. Spencer smiled when he heard she'd left, like a man who thinks the world will now line up according to the plan he'd sketched. Clay, across his glass in the city, saw his opening and adjusted his ambitions to fit. The region, always hungry for a decisive story, took the line and fed it until it was a tale of a president who'd let mercy become his ruin. Rook sat on the porch until dawn with the card Clay had left still crumpled in his pocket. He watched the road until it blurred into the same long, indifferent ribbon it had always been. He felt the fracture move through his men, through the farmhouse, through Anna's small, brave exit, and he knew the ledger had not finished its accounting. When the sheriff called the next morning with a question that sounded like a threat, Rook answered like a man who had just lost the one thing that made a home, with a quiet that meant preparation. He had opened a door, and the world had answered. The fracture had widened, and the pieces of his life were scattering in directions he could not predict. He had made a choice. The choice had fracture lines now, and the judgment was ready to fall. On the highway into town, a truck with no plates turned its lights on and followed at a measured distance. Inside it sat a face Rook did not know, and the driver grinned at something in the dark, like a man who knew where the tide would pull next. Rook thought of Anna and the photograph of Thomas tucked away in the duffel, of Mateo's small hands, and of the ledger hands that wanted to see his house burned for the art. He thought, with a clarity that made the marrow in his bones ache, that whatever came next would not be a quiet thing. The fractures would deepen. Secrets laid bare would sting like salt. Men would take positions. The charter would cleave and argue and choose. Anna had gone, but the fissure she left behind was not empty. It was a space that demanded a rebuilding no club rule could dictate. Rook folded the crumpled card and slid it into the back pocket of his jeans. He would not yet speak to his men as a wounded man. He would ride, he would gather truth, and he would count consequences. The call came the night after Anna left. Matteo had been taken. Rook felt it like a punch to the gut. The voice on the line was Hector's, breath sharp, words tumbling. They grabbed him at the truck stop outside town. Lyle, Clay's dog, took him, said it was a message. The radio and Rook's bike hummed like a live thing as he vaulted into his leathers. Mercy had a price. He would pay it with teeth. He rode like a man with no right to hesitate. The road under him was a line, a promise rewritten every mile. He kept his face still, but inside the motor of him, something old and ferocious turned over. The part of him that had learned to take things back by force when the world tried to steal them. He thought of Anna's hands, the way she'd taught Matteo to hold a wrench, the photograph folded like a hush in the duffel she'd carried. He thought of promises spoken at dawn and of a boy who trusted he had an anchor. At the edge of Clay Winter's compound, Rook stopped long enough to look. The place smelled of diesel and bravado. Clay's men lounged in the glow of a floodlight, laughter like knives. Rook counted them and found that numbers rarely mattered as much as the element of surprise. He sent Hector and 2 prospects to cut a power line and create chaos. He called Spencer's bluff by sending a single man, himself, through the back gate. They found Matteo in a room with shuttered windows, scared but defiant, clutching the little rusted emblem Anna had given him. His captors' faces were smug, certain of the advantage. Clay's plan had been to humiliate Rook, to show the valley that tenderness could be extorted. He had planned for a sermon of submission. He had not planned for a president who would trade votes for a life. Rook struck fast and clean. He moved like the hand of a man who had spent 20 years thinking in violence and mercy both. He took a man's arm and broke attitude with the cold geometry of a practiced hold. Steel met wood in the shock of bodies. Air smelled of copper and rain and effort. The fight was a short, bright thing. Then it was a wound that Rook closed with his own hands, tying an aggressor with rough rope and lowering a kid's head to his. Matteo's eyes were huge and wet and furious. He didn't hug at first. He surveyed Rook as if measuring whether this man would keep his word. Rook knelt and let the boy see the scars on his knuckles and the steadiness in his hands. "You okay?" he asked, voice low and nodded. Matteo nodded, palms pressing the emblem to his chest. "They hurt you?" Rook asked. The boy swallowed. "They wanted to make you leave, make Mama come back with a bargain." The word hung there like a ledger. They rode out under a sky scraping with rain. Clay's men gave chase in a howl of engines and shouting. Rook led them on a run that tore through gravel and hedge, through a world that was used to being ruled by speed and cunning. He tested them, lured them into a narrow cut where the road bent like a question. Hector and the prospects, 2 of them with fear burned out of their faces, blocked the exit. Clay's crew skidded and scattered. Tires spat gravel. The chase was a lesson. You do not take a child of an angel and expect the law of nature to stand. Back at the farmhouse, Don found Rook waiting on the porch like a man who'd been remade by the night. He'd brought Matteo home with scratches and a hunger for waffles and a small, rigid dignity that children adopt when shaken. Anna arrived with the truck's lights cutting through the mist. She ran before she knocked. She saw the boy safe and the way Rook's shoulders had the thread of wear in them. She did not speak at first. She dropped to her knees in front of Matteo and drew him into herself like a bellows pulling flame. Rook watched from the steps, hands tucked into the pockets of a jacket that smelled of road. Anna's eyes found his across the boy, and a storm of things passed between them. Anger, relief, accusation, admiration, love that was not yet named. He stepped down and closed the distance. "He's okay," he said. The statement was simple and enormous. Anna looked at him, and everything she'd left, and everything she'd feared, and everything she'd hoped braided into the single question she asked without shaping it into words. It was an ask of ownership and of apology. Her voice, when it came, was steady but raw. "Why?" she said. "Why risk the club? Why risk us?" Rook's answer was a confession more than an explanation. He told her about the vote, about the cards left by Clay, about the men in the clubhouse who'd chosen fear over mercy. He told her, honestly, about his fear, not of losing his patch, but of losing the small, stubborn family that had crept into his life and loosened bolts he'd never wanted unfastened. "I'd rather fight them than let him be taken," he said. "I'd rather be a man they spit on than have him missing." Anna pressed her forehead to his, the way one repairs something by pressing it together and holding it. The heat of her brow against his was an answer. She said, falling somewhere between a vow and a plea, "Then come with me, fight with me. Don't make me a secret when you ask me to be brave." He reached for her hand, and this time she let him. They stood like two people who had chosen the same side of a line, not because the world had ceded ground, but because they had decided what was worth defending. The farmhouse around them smelled of coffee and wet wood and the small, miraculous relief of a boy who sleeps against a chest that keeps vigil. Rook's reclamation of Mateo forced consequences. The club could grumble, Spencer could rail, Clay could feed rumor into the press. But now the war had a visible starting place, a president who would break rules to keep a child safe. The image spread faster than gossip. Men who'd hesitated saw a leader take a risk and felt the strange, activating warmth of trust. Others recoiled. That night, the charter met. Rook walked into the room with the emblem of a child pinned to his vest, the small scrap of patch Mateo had kept. He laid out what he'd done, the rescue, the chase, the reasons. He did not plead for approval. He offered evidence of what his mercy had produced: a boy home, a woman not exiled, a charter that had been tested and survived if men chose it. The vote that followed was a storm, but it was different this time. Men had seen a choice enacted and a life spared. Some sided with Rook for loyalty, others for the image of a leader who defended more than land. Spencer voted against, thin-lipped, but more men than not stood with Rook. The margin was cleaner now. The club's identity had shifted a notch towards something broader. Anna did not step into the clubhouse that night. She waited on the porch, the boy asleep between them, and when Rook returned, he sat beside her without a patch of formality. They did not need a ceremony. They needed the quiet recognition that two people who had been cautious with trust had chosen to bind. He told her bluntly and without flourish, "I'll answer for what I've done. I'll take whatever comes." She looked up at him, and for the first time let herself imagine a future where the ledger balanced differently. "Then let us be loud about it," she said. "Let them know we're not ashamed." Her hand found his and squeezed. Rook lifted the boy's blanket, smoothed his hair, and felt the shape of his life tilt towards something that was, at once, dangerous and true. He had broken with tradition and made a new law in the space between breath and action. Family would be defended, mercy would be fought for, and he would stand at the line with Anna and Mateo beside him. Outside, Clay counted losses and plotted anew. Inside, a farmhouse lit with cooking and the small rituals of staying had become a fortress no paper threat could easily unmake. Rook's decision would cost him alliances, illusions, the easy admiration of men who preferred a leader without soft edges. But it had bought him something fiercer, a chosen family and the right to claim them in public. He held Anna's hand as the farmhouse settled and the night stitched itself to the earth. They had been honest in ways that left wounds and in ways that set healing in motion. Dawn would bring more fights, and there would be blood to pay. But for one small, defiant moment, the porch held them all. 2 adults who had been broken, and a boy who had been found. And the region watched as a president redefined what it meant to protect. They slept under the same threadbare quilt for the first time 3 nights after the vote, the farmhouse bones creaking like an old bike settling into gear. When Rook woke, he watched Anna breathe beside him, eyes rimmed with the map of recent battles, hair matted with oil and sweat. And for the first time, the idea of waking to someone else's rhythm felt less like a betrayal of the road and more like coming home. The charter had accepted, grudgingly, and then with a new kind of respect. Some men still muttered, but the loudest voices were the ones who'd watched him ride into Clay's compound and come out with a boy. That image had a gravity the ledger couldn't cancel. They rebuilt the farmhouse in small, stubborn pieces. New boards across the porch, a reinforced gate, a shelf for Mateo's tools. Rook taught the prospects to be careful with their judgments. He made the clubhouse a place where a kid's laugh mattered as much as a map of territory. Spencer kept his spite, but his threats thinned when confronted by men who'd seen a president choose a child over reputation. Clay kept watching from his safe glass world, sharpening schemes that could wait. Rook knew there would be more nights where engines sang like war drums, but he had also learned that some fights were worth the scab. Anna took a steady job at the garage in town. Her hands recognized what the hours gave back, and she taught Mateo the old, clean mechanics of patience. Rook handed over small tasks that belonged to home, fixing a leaky porch roof, wiring a lamp. The transactions were humble, but they layered into trust. He told her the parts of the past he could, in fragments that left scars visible and honest. She stitched them with questions and cold, practical tenderness. She forgave what she could not forget. Forgiveness was not forgetting, but choosing a future despite the bruise. Mateo thrived in the shadow of 2 unlikely guardians. He took to sleepless nights with wrench in hand and to Sunday rides with a helmet 2 sizes too big, perched between Rook's shoulders like a secret that belonged to them. The county learned to see the farmhouse lit at dusk as a harbor. People came with needs, fix a fence, mend a muffler, and left thinking that mercy had an engine under its hood. One evening after rain, the 3 of them stood on the porch watching the road shine like a ribbon of gunmetal. Rook put his hand on Anna's back, and she rested her cheek against his shoulder, grease and skin and a quiet warmth. Mateo slid an arm through both of theirs, small and fierce as a patch. Out on the horizon, a lone bike crossed the ridge and vanished into dusk. The road still called him, always would. But now the pull of going and the pull of staying both had a place. The charter would judge. Clay would plot. The world would continue to demand accounts be settled. But that night, in the kitchen that smelled of coffee and oil, the ledger closed on one line. They were family, and that was a law Rook would ride to defend.